So Taylor, man, great to speak with you, brother. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited that Charlie could make the connection.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So why don't you take us, like, I'd love for you to help the audience better understand Basic Block and what you guys are doing over there.
Yeah, so my name's Taylor Monks. I'm 27. I'm the CEO and I'm one of the co-founders at Basic Block. There was two originals of us, myself and Brett Byman. Really, we work as kind of a payment solution for all these trucking companies out throughout across the United States. So 93% of trucking companies out there are actually small mom and pop shops. So 93% are trucking companies that are less than 8 trucks. Those guys typically, can't get credit, can't get advances on fuel, and then you pair that with a lot of the brokers and shippers out there like Amazon and Walmart that extend out their payment terms to 45 days, some to 120 days. They often just can't survive that break in time for them to get paid. So what we do is we underwrite them based on their sales. So really how it works is they use an application that we've developed. They kind of upload all their documents. We do a lot of cool tech in the background. We get them paid instantly for a really, really fair price. We invoice for them, we collect for them, and then we underwrite them based on kind of their portfolio of like, hey, you need a new truck. We see you're hauling, $30,000, $40,000 a month with these, AAA rated brokers. We can extend you credit on these accounts receivable and essentially help you grow your business, buy another truck, get more fuel. And then we kind of have all these partners in the background because we aggregate a lot of these small players. It's often really difficult for our partners to work with them and one-offs. So we then go kind of be their, back end and negotiate deals for them on repairs and maintenance, on tires, on fuel. And then really we just kind of sit in the middle of that and payment process everything. So we don't charge anything for our software. We just make money holistically on the payments. That's how it kind of works for us today.
So where did the genesis of this idea come from?
Yeah, so the truth is, in 2017, I dropped out of college. I was a junior there. I was going to be a senior. When I left college, I'd made some money in cryptocurrency, Bitcoin at the time. I had, about 70 grand in my pocket, which felt like $1 million at that moment, being like a 21-year-old. And I dropped out of college and I moved to London, which is where my dad lives. My real dad lives over in London. And the thesis was, hey, let's just build something. The reality was I didn't do much but, party too much probably in London and came back to Nebraska, which is where my stepdad, my mom was, and really where I grew up here in the Midwest. Came back and my mom picked me up from the airport. My mom is a pretty intense person, like any, probably mom, but my mom is very in your face. We kind of had that style of family. And, she was like, you just dropped out of college and you just kind of turned down these job offers and, you broke up with your long-term girlfriend who's going to be a doctor and all this kind of stuff. And she kind of was like, what are you going to do with your life? And just so happened at that time that she had picked me up from the airport, there's a lot of trucking companies that have, offices and docks near the Omaha airport. I mean, I just looked out the window and at the time I saw some trucking and saw docks and it was honestly just a thing to get my mom off my back. So I said, hey, I'm going to work with trucks, and, find out a couple of years later, that now I'm obsessed about it. But at the time, my mom was very quick to point out that I knew nothing about trucks and she was definitely right. So really the genesis came from, I was always interested in building products. I had been in college and had, helped build some products and pitch some ideas. And I had worked at some startups. But I didn't really know what I wanted to do. And when I finally took the jump and dropped out of college, it was honestly my mom yelling at me and me seeing some trucks on the side of the road and saying, we'll do that.
And did you start this? You say you got a co-founder. Was your co-founder on board of this, or was it your idea? Then you brought somebody on?
Yeah.
Afterwards?
So at the time, Brett is he's kind of the dad of the group. So I'm the one that's probably doing stupid things, probably risking it all. And Brett's really good operationally. So Brett was founder and CEO at another company in Lincoln, Nebraska at the time of that. And that company was great and it was growing, but it wasn't growing as fast as I thought we could grow together. So I ended up saying, hey, man, you're not a CEO, you're a COO, and you should come run all these internal ops for this company. And, God willing, he took the jump and decided to come with me. And at the time, it was very bar napkin style. We met at a bar and I kind of told him my idea and he kind of was like, okay, this is interesting. I'll advise you. And, we had been friends for years at that point. And I knew when Brett finally put his name to like, I'll advise you here. In all reality, Brett's very similar to me. He's either all in or all out. And when he
Right.
said that moment, I knew he was in. And he likes to say that he wasn't in at that point in time, but he definitely was. And then kind of the next year we spent really just kind of me figuring it out. So, Brett had made some money in his career, so he was kind of floating me and basically keeping me alive for a lot of the first year into 2018. And then end of 2018, beginning of 2019 is really when we kind of hit our stride probably and started to figure out what we were doing.
I mean, this is fascinating to me because a lot of times you talk to people that are solving these problems, a big problem, but it's still a discrete problem in a very particular niche space that's technology quite hasn't been able to get into. It's, yeah. And I want to talk a little bit more about, what it's like selling into that space and the sophistication of your clients. But how did you know this problem existed? Like, was it a lot of like lean startup type stuff or?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I've read a lot of those books, and in my other startups I had worked in, like operationally, I cut my teeth pretty heavily in a startup in Lincoln where I learned how to validate problems and like not get bias from it. And keep in mind, I also knew nothing. I knew nothing about trucking. So anything that anybody told me, I didn't have bias to even have. Like I didn't know anything. So very quickly, I'm a solve it by do it type of person. I'm a solve it by like get dirty. So we started off doing a lot of research and looking into trucking, and you see the general problems that a lot of these companies have built now. Some that are investors like Project 44, who is saying, hey, we want to be able to track and trace these truckers, or provide visibility. And then there's a lot of these other companies that are providing loads for them, like the Uber Freight. And I felt very strongly about payments. I had a decent background in payments, and I knew a lot about that. And I was very into payments and currencies. And I was an international business major, and I was really good. And in school, I was really great at finance. And I just kind of thought, let's just go down this route. And even on my original white paper, if you kind of read it and look back at it, my thesis it was actually not much different than it is today. Now the product has changed a lot, but the thesis on kind of like what my belief was in the market is very similar. So I don't know, I don't know why I had this idea, but the way that I really validated it and figured it out was very lean startup method. And what we did, which was the biggest thing, is I got in trucks with drivers. So I hitchhiked, thousands of miles with drivers that I didn't know, across Interstate 80, essentially from Fremont, Nebraska, all the way to Chicago. You name it, Cincinnati, Texas,
Sure.
all those places. And I learned by really doing. So I didn't know these people, but I just kind of said, hey, I'm a kid. If you let me ride with you, I have some questions, and I'll get out eventually whenever you drop me off, and I'll figure out a ride home. And I would do that for weeks at a time, and then kind of figure out like, okay, this is how it works, and this is where these problems are. And then very quickly, I found out that like, okay, this bleeding at the neck problem, like this, where blood is spewing everywhere, which is typically where like you want to focus on, your product. That was like this cash flow, which is what we really doubled down on, and it worked like overwhelmingly.
That's amazing, by the way. I've never quite heard that before, but it makes so much sense. What better way to do customer research or potential customer research than, lock yourself in a cab of a truck for, 14-hour stints?
Yeah, so a lot of people would call me crazy for doing that, but I still do stuff like that today, right? So like if we want to know something about a product, we go out live and do it. So now, half our team lives in Nebraska and I live in Chicago because a lot of our partners are here in Chicago. And and I don't want to be in the situation where I like have to think. I want to go do. So a perfect example is we're having conversations with fuel companies to give our truckers, fuel discounts. And, yesterday I was on a call with them and, saying, how does this work for a trucker? How would this work? And, they're explaining it to me and talking to me. And then I just go, hey, where's the nearest location to me in Chicago that your truck stop is at? And they pull one up and I say, great, I'm just going to go there tonight. And then I go to the truck stop and I sit there and I ask truckers, how does this work? What do you like? What do you not like? And I ask cashiers, okay, how does it work in the back end? And I learned the best by doing. I mean, oftentimes I think the problems in supply chain logistics, people like to make them really complex. But they're not. They're often not. There's a lot of easy, slick ways to solve solutions. And the way that I like to solve them is on the ground, boots on the ground, like commando style, first guy in, let me figure it out, and then bring in the troops later, and to kind of establish like what the actual process will be.
So, I mean, I love that. It makes all the sense in the world. There's a level of like fearlessness there that I don't think a lot of people maybe have, or I don't even know if fearlessness is the right word, but like, where did that come from? Was that something that was taught to you? Was it a conscious decision, or is it just like who you are? It's just innate. Like, hey, that's how I learn stuff.
Yeah, I don't know. I think like it's happened so many times, and that I know that it works the best. I related a lot to like in the early stage of a company. You kind of have these like layers of company. At the beginning, you want these commandos, like you want these people that you drop in behind enemy lines and are kind of like Swiss Army knife guys that are really like solid and have really good training, and might not be like the best sniper, but they can definitely hit the shot, right? Like when they need to, and they're grinders, and they're going to be the ones that kind of crawl through the mud and move an inch an hour to get like where they need to go. And that's like early stage what I'm really good at. Like I'm good at jumping in behind enemy lines and like being really scrappy and not having all the tools that I need, but solving the problems I need to. And then later you start to bring in soldiers, and those soldiers kind of like are the next layer of the company, which is really like those people are here to, establish some process, establish some order, and really like kind of gather what's going on and create the rules and the process. And then you bring in the policemen, and the policemen then just maintain like that order. And that's what happens. And as you kind of go down that, there's these different level of employees and different like mindsets. And early on, we did a really good job of figuring out who is a commando and who is a policeman, because we didn't want policemen. We wanted commandos dropping in and figuring out these problems. We didn't want people just like maintaining the order and like not willing to get dirty. And maybe that's like a not the greatest comparison, but that's like how we think of it at Basic Block in kind of those tiers.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So you guys are doing great. You guys just closed a pretty substantial round. Where are you guys in your guys' lifestyle? Life cycle? Are you guys still heavy in product development, or are you starting to look at scale?
Yeah, so we're like both, I would say. I lead our product team, so the majority of where I spend most of my time is recruiting, fundraising, and then product. I like really enjoy product, so I would say probably we're in this both area where we're trying to scale up our entire team, and then also we're trying to continue to develop. So the majority of our resources go into engineering, where we're building a lot of cool technology, in routing, expense tracking, all these different tools for truckers that they've never really had access to. We just partnered with Visa to launch, a credit card that's going to be one of the first credit cards, or it is one of the first credit cards in North America for a trucker to manage their entire business on. So we've done a lot of cool stuff in terms of product development, and that will always happen, for as long as I'm running, the show and I'm the CEO. Like I really enjoy thinking about kind of the product and where the next evolution in the market's going. Like I really thrive in that sense. And then the scale part of it is like getting the actual people to do the work, bringing in the soldiers essentially now to like scale up some of the platform is challenging for sure, just because as you grow, the company culture changes a lot. But it's definitely something that we're in right now. So like you said, we just raised a significant amount. It was 78 million, I think is the final, total of what it will be. To date, we've raised about, I think it's around 85-ish, somewhere around there, 80, 82, 83. I'm not really sure now. So this is a significant round of financing that is going, to everything that you can imagine: sales, marketing, ops, engineering, leadership, just kind of everything in general.
So when you're raising that first $5, $6, $7 million, I'm not sure where that money came from. Sure, some family office, maybe a little bit of institutional, some friends and family. Going to what I'm assuming is a very large institutional round. How has that changed for you as being a CEO? I'm sure there's more people that have joined your board. There's more people coming in, and you're getting more attention, more direction. What's that experience been like?
Yeah, so it's really cool. So, Charlie, who was on this podcast, earlier, he was really one of our first kind of like, I would say, family friends money. We raised an initial round, which Charlie participated in. And we raised that. I was lucky enough via Charlie, he introduced me to Jason Calacanis, who by all means necessary is really one of the greatest of all time when it comes to early stage investing. At the time, we had really no money at all. We bought a one-way ticket to San Francisco, and we just kind of hoped. And at the time, I had gotten into this kind of like little mini type of like entrepreneur school where they were paying for me to live there. I got a scholarship to go there. They paid for me to stay in San Francisco for 5 weeks. And to me, it was like, okay, this is the weeks that we have to raise the money. I met Jason Calacanis, and pretty much, after we met him, he wrote us a 100K check, and our life pretty much changed. That was a
Mm-hmm.
massive signal investor. He is like early stage. He is who everybody knows and follows in San Francisco. So when we got that check from him, it was very validating to the rest of, really the supply chain kind of world. Like, wow, okay, people are making bets here now. And Jason was one of the first to do that. So we raised money from him, and he's an angel, but I mean, he's as close to institutional as you probably could get from an angel standpoint.
Sure.
And then very quickly we raised, institutional. So we raised institutional. It was the first couple million we raised institutional. And then we raised this round, which is obviously a much larger institutional. As far as how it's changed, I think investors understand that I'm a pretty transparent founder. So I tell you the good and the bad all the time. I don't really care, and I don't really, I don't really sugarcoat it. What I do best in, and what our investors know that I do best in, is kind of let me be. So coach me, like from the outside, but inside the walls, let me just do what I want to do. Sometimes it doesn't make sense, and there isn't rationale behind it because there's just sometimes I'm just in my brain, it doesn't make sense, or I can't explain it. But generally, me doing me, which is a lot of small experiments, works out in us figuring out things really fast, and then kind of allows us to move. But when I get too many cooks in the kitchen that are kind of telling me how to do it or what to do, generally it gives me like paralysis by analysis. Like I'm trying to get too many opinions to make my own decision. And sometimes democracy is like the killer of speed sometimes. So
Yeah.
sometimes it just has to be, me doing it. So our investors, nothing's really changed for me. If anything, we just have more money, which is cool. And I get to hire, cooler people that are smart and much smarter than me. But in terms of like freedom and like how all things shake out and work, no, I think even more so, I've been kind of more empowered to make the decisions that I want to make and make them faster, which is like a really cool feeling for me, especially as a 27-year-old.
Yeah. So as you guys look at scaling, I know you come from Omaha. Now you're in Chicago. It sounds like the team's kind of split. Are you guys looking? I mean, we're in this post-COVID world. It seems like everybody's much more comfortable in this kind of like remote, everybody works from their home office type of thing. Are you guys going to have a headquarters somewhere? Are you guys looking at multiple headquarters? Or are you going to be comfortable with this sort of like global team?
Yeah, so it doesn't really bother me. I'm probably old school in terms of like what I like. I like the office, though I'm probably the least productive in the office in terms of me, and then making everybody else not productive either. So me, in fact, I have a home office that's a block away from our actual office in Lincoln as well. So that I often stay at, a decent amount. So the way that I think about remote is very hub and spoke model. So I think about like almost like I think about these hubs, like Chicago is a really good hub for us, right? Like it's it's an international airport. You can get to anyone really quickly. There's always flights, big city, easy to recruit to. And to think of kind of Lincoln and Omaha and, let's just say Milwaukee and Ann Arbor and all these kind of littler, like big towns that are around them as almost these spokes. So I foresee us having like a lot of headquarters in these hubs. Where those hubs are, Chicago will be one of them. And then, I see like little small offices with individuals out. A perfect example of that is out in Lincoln, right? So, our global HQ for now is in Lincoln, and it will stay there for as long as we can keep it there. But the way that I think about remote work is more like, hey, we want the place for them to come if they want to come, but wherever they're at, they can be at. And if they want to travel here, it's a very short flight for them to get there, or short drive for them to get there, to be in the office, to interact with the individuals that they want to see or work with on a day-to-day.
Yeah, several years ago, it felt a little bit like, if you wanted to be a, tech startup, you wanted to be able to raise money. Yeah, everybody, the Silicon Valley was kind of the place to be, and it's still without a doubt. I mean, one of the major hubs. But have you seen a shift in the last couple of years with that?
People like to say there's one, but no. I think Silicon Valley is where a lot of stuff happens, and there's a lot of talent there, and network effects, right? Like tons of them. And because of that, I think, it allows you to recruit and build faster and get more engineers and almost have a little more validation. The cost of living though is so much dramatically higher that there's a
Yeah.
reason they have to raise so much more funds to survive out there.
Hmm.
Um, but I mean, I think venture capital in general, I think I mean, it doesn't bother us because I get on a plane. Like I'm 27, I have a dog. That's really it, and I'm able to just get on a plane and go. So I don't really care. But I think for like a lot of founders that probably have families and kids and wives and significant others that they can't do that often. So it's harder for them to go raise those rounds and like take the jump of like, yeah, when I show up, it's like I don't care where I'm at, and investors don't often care either because they just know if they want to see me, I'll get on a plane in seconds and be there. So the shift, I would say, is there a shift to more venture capital being out in the world? Yeah, there's more money than there ever's been, that's for sure. But is it going to the Midwest? I would say no. I'd say the majority of it is out in Silicon Valley, New York,
Yeah.
Miami, and that's just the way it is. I think that's just how it is right now for for the market, and I don't know that will ever change, to be honest.
Yeah. So let's take a step back because you grew up in did you grow up in the Lincoln area?
Yeah, so I've moved around a ton. I was born in London, and where my dad lives currently, and then I moved to Nebraska, and then we moved to a few places in Nebraska. Went to Arizona for a few years, and then came back to Lincoln. Really, in like seventh grade was when I came back.
Mhm.
I don't remember much of Arizona, but Lincoln was, or like Nebraska, and kind of that kind of when I moved here was really when, like, I would say I grew up probably.
Yeah, and you were an athlete, right? I mean, you
Yeah,
attended.
so I was the classic. My stepdad was a varsity football coach out at Mesquite High School in Arizona and Gilbert, and then I would be at every practice and every weightlifting thing and every film session, hanging out with all the players, and then moved to North Platte and Nebraska, and I was there. My seventh grade year. My dad he was the freshman coach then, and then was the offensive coordinator on the varsity team. So I'd still go ride my bike to the varsity practice every day. Then I got into football, and then that's kind of where I remember getting into football when I was in Arizona. And my real first memory of Nebraska is I remember my mom sat me and my brother down, and at the time, we were decent football players, but we weren't that great. We weren't very
Mhm.
good in terms of like just being good football players. We hadn't really grown up or figured out who we were, what position we were going to play. And I remember my mom saying to us, Nebraska is going to be a lot different. These kids know how to play football. They eat, breathe, and sleep football in Nebraska, and instead of Arizona. And I remember thinking, we were going to come to Nebraska and suck. And very quickly we realized, like, oh yeah, we can compete too. And even now, I think about that moment a lot, because I remember when we went out to Silicon Valley, being from Nebraska, them saying, out in Silicon Valley, these guys are going to be a lot better startups. And then we showed up and we're like, wait, we can compete here too. So it's kind of been like a theme really in my life where, we got from Nebraska, we played football, played high school at North Platte, transferred out to a smaller school where my dad became a superintendent there. So he wasn't my coach anymore. And then went and played collegiate football at Nebraska Wesleyan, which was really fun. I enjoyed that. It's where I made some of my best friends.
Yeah, absolutely. What position did you play?
I played wide receiver.
Okay.
Um,
And when you made your decision to drop out and jump into the business world, was that one of those things that was tough to leave at the time?
Yeah, it was actually that was probably the hardest thing. I loved my football coach. When I was in high school, I was pretty good. I played wide receiver, and then I was a specialist, and then played defensive back. And I came to college, and I think like just where I was at, like I think I got worse when I got to college, which is kind of crazy. But I think I didn't like my coaching. I felt afraid to like mess up and instead of like just go make plays, which is kind of what I was used to.
Hmm.
Um, so like I kind of realized like, hey, like I'm just more now a role player. Like I'm not the star that I was in high school. Like my job here is to support other wide receivers, and I'm really good at playbook, and I'm really good at reading coverages, and that I can support in that way. So I became much more of a role player when I got to college, and I liked that. That was fun for me, and I enjoyed practice. And then I got to my junior year, going to my senior year, and I do remember my coach, saying, you're the last person that I thought would, kind of, leave the team. And when I told him, well, I'm not just leaving the team, I'm actually, leaving college in general. He was pretty surprised at that for sure, and that was definitely easily one of the hardest things I had to do. It was harder than probably telling my parents, to be honest.
So you talked about the crypto, right? And I know we started the story off. You made some money. I think you said $70,000. Did you make this in college, or was this right after you?
Yeah, no, this was in college. So when I was in college, I was really into cryptocurrency early on. I was always into just weird technology, So I was really into that, and I was putting tons of money. In fact, the last 2 years, I've taken my entire salary in Bitcoin. I'm like really progressive and stuff like that, where I was depositing tons and tons of money that I could possibly get my hands on into cryptocurrency, and it was just going up and up and up and up and up. I took it out, almost at the right time. Really, what happened was I was in Nebraska Thanksgiving 2017, and a lot of I knew a lot about cryptocurrency, but I didn't openly talk about it to really anyone, just because it was like
Yeah,
it was hard to like grasp, and people in
yeah,
Nebraska are fairly conservative. And I was at my at Thanksgiving, 2017, and one of my cousins was talking to like one of my aunts about Bitcoin, and I was like, oh shit. I was like, if these people know about it in Nebraska, then that's like the sign of a bubble, and I need out. So like
yeah.
literally that day or the next day, I sold every single dime of cryptocurrency, and then in a couple weeks it crashed like no one could ever believe. Which was so I got really lucky, but I felt very convinced that like, oh wow, if these people are talking about it, I need to get out because this seems like they don't know enough to be in it.
So I kind of following, and I'm sure you are because you seem like you're just naturally curious and follow a lot of things. But there's kind of this Web 3.0.
Yeah, it's
A
cool.
little bit of a buzz term type thing, right? Metaverse. You got guys like Gary Vee and all these guys that are like super on board with it. We're seeing the rise of the NFTs. I know it's early, but what are your thoughts on that space in general?
Yeah, so I really like it. Like I'm a big I have a few NFTs, and I really like them. I think that they are worth what they're worth? No way. Like no, I do not. But I just like it. Like I really like the community, and I think that that's what's cool about cryptocurrency is the community is really strong. And there's a really great community. So for me, I'm really interested in it. I obviously have bought some NFTs. In fact, I tried to be in the Constitution DAO. I don't know if you heard about that, where there was a decentralized autonomous organization that was trying to buy one of the constitutions. They raised like
Interesting.
$45 million in like 7 days, and there was a bunch of like 20-year-olds that were trying to figure it out. I put money into that too. I was like, screw it, like I'll try and buy the Constitution. So I think that it's really interesting. I think that we are super early. My big like ploy to everyone, and I'm obviously at the kind of bleeding edge of a lot of this tech, so a lot of my friends get to come in with me. Like when I see this constitution or DAO that it's so silly, but it's like let's just do it. Like let's put a couple $100 or a couple grand in there. I'll often bring my friends with me. So like I think that my advice generally is it doesn't make sense, and that's okay. Like it's part of it is fun, and part of it is like figuring it out and doing it, and as you do it, you learn. And that's the best part about Web3 and like cryptocurrency is the more people that learn and get exposed to it, that's a really big win in general, because it is coming and it's going to be a thing. And I think that the earlier that you can expose yourself to it, like the better. And I think that my job and my friend group is, not necessarily to make money on those, but it is to bring people into the community that haven't ever been in there before. So I'm not like as deep as I am now, but I obviously see a ton of it on Twitter, and I follow a ton of people. And some of my really good friends are founders at some really amazing, like huge cryptocurrency companies that I believe in it, and I get pretty excited about it. But I don't like ever go into it thinking I'm going to make money on it. I just kind of go into think like this is cool. I want to own part of the Constitution.
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah,
and it's like, what are we gonna? People ask me, what were you gonna do with it if you won it? And it's like, I don't really know. Like, I don't know
yeah.
what we were gonna do with the Constitution. Like, but that was like not the point. The point was like, just can we do this as a group? And Web3 and like blockchain and cryptocurrency allow groups to collaborate like that before, like when they've never been able to do that before.
Yeah, it's one of those things where, like, if you look at it now, there's so many kind of fundamental issues that that exist. I mean, just even looking like just the gas costs and using Ethereum
Yeah,
and
it's nuts right now.
yeah, and it's slow. It's not, there's things that are in place, but I think the foundation of where this is going to go, like I do, I'm kind of a believer in the Web3 and sort of the decentralization and almost democratization of assets and digital assets, and I do think we're moving into more digital worlds. I don't know, the metaverse thing was a little strange, kind of Ready Player One, kind of like
Yeah, it's very real, and I think that we've always been interested in it, and I'm very interested in it. That we've even toyed around with the idea of what if we could take all these invoices that like
mhm.
these truckers are, and we could tokenize them. So anyone in the
Yeah,
world, you included, if you'd like to have a portfolio of trucking invoices, you could have, and some dude in China could buy a trucker's invoice, in Iowa with yen, and that trucker could get funded immediately with dollars, right? That's like a really powerful, proposition for people that are looking for capital and cheap capital.
yeah.
Um, that we've obviously toyed around with, like, what if we could do that, and could we ever do that? And I think that everybody always asks me, because obviously on Twitter and all these other places, I always am chirping about blockchain, and I'm taking my salary in Bitcoin and doing all these crazy things that they always ask me, are you guys ever going to do anything with that? Or investors can kind of get scared of that, and I always tell them the same thing. I want to, but today, like, we're really focused on just building, and hopefully in 10 years down the road, when you know we want to do something like that, we can set ourselves up to like try to. But today, like, it's just not feasible, just because of all the fees and the slow and all that stuff you're kind of talking about.
Right. Yeah, no, I think there's a big opportunity, and I think you're seeing it more and more with people building uh, solutions that perform the utility of the promise of what we're seeing today, but doing it in a way that's scalable. I was actually going to ask you that question. I think you just answered it. And are you guys looking at it at Basic Block, and is there any way to apply it to current business? Uh, so let's get back to your business, right? Your freight, transportation, logistics, absolutely huge. Gonna only get bigger. I'm not an expert in the space, so excuse my ignorance if any in anything I say here. But from the outside, everybody talks about the opportunity there, and you've seen so many technology startups, and maybe I see them a little bit more closely because I'm connected with Charlie, and I see everything that Charlie's doing, the companies he's investing in and working in. Um, Tough to break into, very fragmented, especially when you start to get into the trucking business, you start to get into the freight brokerage side of the business. Maybe it's stereotypical, maybe it's true, I'm not sure. Maybe not the most tech savvy or group of early adopters that exist. How have you looked at this, and how are you overcoming this? Because obviously you are. You guys are crushing it. You're doing well.
Yeah, so it's I think it's just like a foundational, like, cultural type of thing that we're good at. We're really good at acquiring truckers, and I think partially because we're really good at communicating. So, like, just the way that we built our company, like, you won't ever get a call tree. Almost everything is direct cell phones. In fact, my direct cell phone is on the website still. Um, that, like, it is and it says 24/7. You can call me. Half the time people call, and I have literally, now there's no way I could ever solve a problem because I don't know the problems, like, or I don't know how to solve them sometimes. But I think that the way that we solve it is, we do spend a lot of time on UX UI, so the user experience, and how that feels and how it looks and how it's designed. We do a lot of testing, and we're lucky enough that we do live in the Midwest, that we can leave our office with engineers and go 5 minutes down the road and find one of the largest truck stops along Interstate I-80, where there will be tons of truckers there that we can do real live market testing of, like, how does this feel and how are they interacting with it. So again, like, the way that we overcome that is we get out in person and we test live on site. So we don't often, there's a lot of times at Basic Block that a meeting will be happening, and that meeting will be asking each other questions about how to solve something. And somebody will likely say, why don't we just go try it? And everybody will load up in somebody's truck and drive down the road for 10 minutes and just grab as many truckers as they can and get a pool and then come back to the office. So we tried is real life testing, and then I think that we're just honest and open with our customers. So like we do a really good job of communicating when there's troubles and problems and challenges. Um, and we default all of the time to, like we want to pay you as fast as humanly possible. Like, so that mindset of just like pay fast is always in the back of everybody's mind. So it's like solve problems fast, pay these truckers fast, like do whatever it takes to get them paid, instantly.
Yeah.
Which is a big, like, I think again, like it's not necessarily, how do we solve these problems, but it's kind of like mental. Like it's like, I think we've mentally just like, and culturally just like ingrained the importance of some small things into our heads at the very beginning that have like translated today that make us really good at what we're doing, for our customers. And that's why they like it.
Mm-hmm. There's been some stuff in the media just talking about the trucking industry in general. More and more difficult for truckers to, make a living. Companies, don't want to pay necessarily what's involved. Cost of living, inflation continues to go up. Fuel pricing continues to go up.
Yeah.
How do you? Is that something that you're seeing? I mean, you're close to it. I mean, you're talking.
Yeah,
to these guys
we are
on a
like
daily
as
basis.
closest as you can be to some of these owner operators. So, the way we solve that, we do a lot of work on like financial like literacy for a lot of these truckers. So like we help them save a lot of money in all aspects of insurance, of fuel, of truck trailer leasing, of their credit card bills, of everything. We're trying to save them money. And then we're also trying to teach them what to do with these savings. So like create layaway accounts. So we're creating layaway accounts. We're creating maintenance funds. We're creating all these different like little funds for them in the background that they can see and touch whenever they want. But at the end of the day, like, we do a lot of education on, hey, this money should stay here, because historically we've seen, when your truck gets over 800,000 miles, like you're at a high risk of something large happening where it could be a 5-10 grand expense. And we don't want that truck to not be on the road. So we need to keep this maintenance fund topped, at this, around this area. Right. And we do a lot of that, and it works really well, and we have a lot of really great data too. That's like one of the beauty, like the best part about our business, and probably the most valuable, is the data that we get is like so direct and from the source.
Mm-hmm.
That we're able to do a lot of cool things to leverage that and underwrite on it that essentially help us, predict with some certainty that, things can happen, or breakdowns can happen, or fuel prices can skyrocket. And in fact, like we as a collective group can look at all our truckers and sometimes say like, look, like, a perfect example of this is one of my buddies works in oil out in, North Dakota for a company. And he was saying, man, we're having a lot of trouble finding truckers. And I go, yeah, I could have told you that 2 weeks ago. And he goes, well, how do you know that? And I go, well, if you look at, we have a heat map of where we know these truckers are hauling. It's like they're all going down towards the hurricane when Hurricane Ida was going on, right? And they're picking up everything from the hurricane and they're moving it in the south. So like at that moment, and, we start to realize like, oh, wow, like the data that we have, like we can start to say as these economic things happen, as hurricanes happen, as, flooding happens, as all these different crazy things that happen, these truckers are going to move to ship goods there because people are, panic buying, or all these different things. And when they do that, that means they're going to buy fuel there, which means fuel prices there are likely, going to increase, and all these different things, right? So we can predict and say with some certainty, okay, hey, the next natural disaster that happens in Florida, we need to be pouncing as soon as we possibly can on fuel companies to get fuel discounts locked in for the next month or two, because when our truckers go down there, the prices are going to rise, and we don't want them to be susceptible to those price increases. So that's just like a really good example of like what we're doing and how we're doing it, and how we're leveraging stuff that we have out there to kind of help them on the back end.
Yeah, no, that's amazing, man. I love that. No wonder you guys have been as successful, and not just your business, but obviously raising some capital. So look, you strike me as a guy that doesn't get rattled easily. I looking on LinkedIn, I think it shows that you guys have like 13 employees,
I
which is,
I think we have like 10.
yeah, like 10 employees. You guys just closed $78 million in capital. Your burn's got to be like next to nothing.
It is, yes. It is very small.
If I was sitting in your seat, I think the most stressful thing would be how to deploy all this capital. right? I mean, the investors didn't invest for you to hold on to it; they want you to spend it. How do you kind of take that on? I mean, that's
So, when we went out and tried to raise this round, a big thing for me was I want to be able to get the people I want to get. Like if I
yeah.
want, if I want the best, I want to be able to get them, and I don't want salary to be a question anymore.
Hmm.
Like I just want the best talent, and often now I'm running into that talent and thinking like I would love to have you. I just don't know that I can afford that salary, and
Yeah.
that's not a great feeling for me because I know the impact that they could have on the business. So deploying the capital, do I have to deploy it all? We'll find ways. Trust me. There's always ways that
Yeah.
I creatively, I'm like, I could do this or do that.
Is acquisition kind of on the table?
No, I don't think so. Not for us. So I think that the majority of it will go into engineering, and there's a lot of, like I was talking about, a lot of that data that we have. There's a ton of data science that needs to go into that,
Hmm.
and I'd be lying if I said we're not having to manually pull some of that now and predict, right? Because we kind of are, and a lot of that needs to get to the point where like we can do it with such accuracy that it and do it automated that takes time and that takes resources and expensive resources. So for us, I think the deploying the capital, it is obviously going to be tough, but trust me, we're going to go from 10 to, God knows how many people in the next year. Um, and on top of that, we have to continue to fund all the invoices that we have. And that grows, significantly daily as we onboard more and more and more truckers. That happens all the time. So yeah, I think, I've just learned at this point, I'm still young, obviously, but I've gone through a lot in starting the business, and like I've learned a lot of things that probably a lot of founders never learn and probably never want to
Hmm.
learn. Um, that I generally, yeah, like I don't get excited or I don't get like stressed anymore. I just am like I try and stay as even keeled as I possibly can because at the end of the day, like I just don't want to expend energy that like is not really like is not worth it, if that makes sense. It's just more important
Yeah.
for me as an individual to like be very calm and collected and thoughtful. So a terrible thing, I did. In ways that I do that now, obviously I'm still young, so I still go out and party, and I'm doing all the stupid things that I probably shouldn't be doing. I ended up getting a dog like last year, and that's been like a huge thing for me. And Charlie was like super against it when I first got it because he's like, no, you need to be super focused. But now, I think he would even look back and say, this dog is like given me some type of responsibility, so I can't go out and party all the time, and it also forces me to have like alone time. So it forces me to like go on a walk with her, which on those walks, I generally is where I get the opportunity to decompress and often think about all the things that are going on, where it just allows me to help make clearer, more focused, like data driven decisions a lot of the times, which is really valuable
Yeah.
for us as a company.
I mean, look, one of the things I'm going to take away from this conversation, and I think a lot of people out there listening would take away from this conversation is, if you want to go out there and you want to solve a problem, one of the best ways, or really most important things you need to do is really truly understand the problem. So, don't try to solve it sitting at your computer screen behind a keyboard. You need to go out there and you need to talk to your customers. You need to understand their problem and what you're looking to do. And I love the fact, I mean, the story of you jumping into trucks, with guys and taking these trips from, Nebraska up to Illinois. I mean, it's just like, it's amazing to me. What other, and you talked a lot about this. You're a young kid, but you've done a lot and you've learned a lot of lessons. I mean, what are some of the other lessons that you've learned or some advice you'd give to young entrepreneurs?
Oh, pay your lawyers for sure. You never want to pay them, and they always suck, but just pay them anyway because they'll save you so many times.
Yeah.
I think that's a big thing. And then I think another thing that I constantly say is, don't be concerned about the problems like that you're going to create and the unknowns. Just be concerned about the problem that's in front of you today. Like it's always okay to like put some thought into the things that are going to happen, but the majority of the time they don't happen, or they happen unexpectedly, or they happen in a way that you didn't predict. And the more time that you waste thinking about how to solve problems you don't have, the less time that you're actually building. And what we've learned at Basic Block, and we do this today even still, is we don't we don't really worry it. Like it's a very like, again, culture driven thing where we know that we're going to run into problems down the road, but we just don't care. We openly say like, yeah, we will solve that. That's a problem for another day. Because about all that you really have to do in startups is just continue to move like an inch forward every single day. And that's faster and farther than anyone else is moving. I can promise you that. And if you do that, and you do that consistently over time, that compounds out and you start to see returns that a lot of large organizations and some medium-sized organizations and some small that just don't want to be agile organizations will never see. So for me, my advice is always just do. Don't worry about it. Just do. And then when you raise venture capital, the stakes are even larger. So you get to do with the expectation that you probably are going to burn money in doing it. So you learn a lot faster, and you learn a lot bigger things a lot faster, which is always really cool too.
Yeah, no, I love that, man. I had a mentor who used to always say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time.
Yeah.
And it's like something I tell like my kids, like my daughter. And it's, like she'll look at her room and she, hey, clean your room. And she's 8 years old. Right. And I can just tell she's like overwhelmed. Like, how do I do this? Because it's just such a mess, because that's what 8-year-olds do.
Yeah.
And you're like, you know what? Go pick up that sock. Like you got to start with one little thing, like pick up that sock, put it in the hamper. And it's like, now go pick that up and put it into your drawer. Right. Like, and it's like, if you try to look at this giant task in front of you, right? Hey, I want to build this, multi-billion-dollar unicorn that's going to transform the way the trucking industry works and connect all these dots and create data. Like, it can almost be overwhelming. But like, if you take those little baby steps every single day, you kind of continue to move forward, do the next thing. You make the right decisions. It's amazing what you can accomplish.
Well, yeah, it's like I go back to that commando thing, right? Like they might move an inch an hour, but they're still moving in the right direction, slowly but surely, and the enemy does not know they're there. Like they don't know they're there, and they're still moving, and that is like I think is a very true statement. I think all you have to do is just move, and oftentimes, and I credit Charlie a lot to like helping us get there and do that is because Charlie's very good at understanding like what is the first step. Because sometimes you don't know what it is, and he's really good, and that's why he's on our board, and that's why he's an investor in our company, and that's why we'll continue to have him invest, and we've been really grateful for that. So I think if there's anything else that comes out of that is find people that are willing to do that for you, and Charlie, if you're in supply chain logistics, Charlie's a good person to know to do that. But if not, you got to find that person that can help you just I guess really just convince you or tell you what the first step is, right?
Yeah. So anybody out there listening, Charlie Dahoney, we did an episode with him a couple weeks back, but you can also look him up. He's a stud. I've known him for a long time. So we'll look, Taylor. It's amazing to have a chance to speak with you. You're a super impressive guy. Having a chance to talk to you. Not surprised by your success at all. You have a very unique sort of disposition and way about yourself that I love. It's like a mix between like pragmatism and like, I'm just going to continue to move forward no matter what, and not going to let anything around me bother me because I have a focus and a vision of what I want to accomplish. And kind of combine those things together with obviously some intellect, and you get a beast of a founder. So.
Yeah, I appreciate it. We've been really lucky. I think I think a lot of those traits and things that just were ingrained in me in a young age, and I was lucky enough to do that. And even before we were talking before the podcast, like that embrace the suck type of thing. I can promise you that if people that are listening, if you start a startup, it's everybody else it all sucks, and you don't know what you're doing, and nobody ever knows, and you feel like you're wrong. But the truth of it is, it's everybody is doing the same thing. I equated a lot to like when we would run sprints at the end of the practice, you're on your knees or you're bent over, and you look over and your best friend's over there too, and he's also dying. And then when the whistle blows to do another one, everybody lines up, and you're like, well, I guess we're going to do another one. And that's kind of like what we all are like, right? Each individual person is kind of very like similar to a company, and and we're all sucking for air and we're all trying to figure it out, but the whistle blows and you go again, and you go again, and you go again. And if you continue to do that, I think that there's a lot of cool things that can happen, and we're lucky enough to have done that, and continue to do that. Right? We still treat ourselves like we're sucking air, even though we have all this money. It's still like a mindset that I think is very valuable to have as a founder and as a startup for sure.
Yeah, I was talking about this with someone the other day about this and the podcast and some of the similarities between athletics and entrepreneurial ventures. And it's exactly that. You touched upon it earlier, right? Like you can't let your highs get too high or your lows get too low. You go out there in a sporting event and, whatever sport it is, and, you have a great performance and a big win, that doesn't mean that you could take the next week off and,
right,
and celebrate. Like if, the next week someone else is going to eat your lunch. Right. So it's constantly like keeping yourself even keeled, realizing that, it's a journey and, you got to keep working hard and busting your ass to be ready for the next challenge that you're going to face.
Yeah, 100%. I think that like a lot of what I've learned and how I interact and just those types of things, I feel like I've gotten from sports. Even with my stepdad being my coach, being the offensive coordinator, there's a lot of, and I think of that relationship very similar to like our board or our investors. Like he's not inside the game, he's not inside the huddle. Like he can't look, and sometimes when you're winning or when you're losing or you're getting your ass kicked, you can kind of look in the eyes of the other players in the huddle and you can feel it. But a coach doesn't feel that from the sidelines. They can't feel that like in the huddle. That I think like my job is very similar to what it was always as the player that ran the plays and as wide receiver. I would go to my dad and we'd spent years together. Obviously, me being a ball boy, to obviously our only family thing we could talk about at dinner on Fridays or really ever it was practice or the game and. I think that we built a lot of history, which is kind of what I've built with Charlie or these other board members or investors that, see it, that we have a relationship that, on the sidelines, they think they feel it, but sometimes they don't know, sometimes on 4th and 1 or 4th and 3, like you feel like what the play should be run, or sometimes the player that needs to have the ball in his hand. Like, and I think that relationship that I had very similar with my dad is very similar to the one that I have with my board, where sometimes I know where we're hot, sometimes I know when we're not. And when the board is, wanting these things, it's like, hey, I know you're upset about these things, but there are other things that we need to like double down on because that's not going to help us being pissed about, a guy missing a block or us losing money. Like we need to focus on like, hey, what's the next play? How are we going to get out of this? Right? Like who's going to make the next play? And I think that a lot of that mindset is kind of, again, I've grown up with, and it has translated really, really, really well to us in building a business.
Yeah, man. Absolutely. Well, hey, brother, anybody out there want to learn a little bit more about you or get in touch with you? What's the best way to reach out?
Yeah, so you can reach out on our website, which is just basicblock.io. It's spelled just how you would think it is spelled. Instead of .com, it's .io. So basicblock.io. If you fill out a form, it'll come and do our hello at BasicBlock, and somebody will get it to me. Otherwise, you can just email me directly, and my email is just taylor@basicblock.io. And if I don't see it, then ping me again, and I'll definitely read it and get back to whoever.
Well, cool, man. Well, look, I had a great time talking to you. I'm going to continue to track your progress. I am expecting big things from you and your company, man.
Yeah, thanks. I really appreciate you for having me on, and I'm happy to be here and share our journey.